Hey, it's Garrett Gaudet, and welcome back to the podcast. Today is a podcast episode that I've been waiting to do for years, and I'm not exaggerating when it comes to years because today I'll be talking about what went wrong for Hudson's Bay from a retail and customer experience perspective. And it's not that we have a lot of history. We do have a lot of history, and it's not just the lead up to the bankruptcy is kind of what all the headlines have been about. But I want to do a deep dive into really what went wrong, and it just didn't happen overnight. So I am a college professor. I am a marketing CX customer experience consultant. So that's kind of the lens I'll be using for this analysis. So it's not so much focusing on the finance part. I know that private equity did play a big part in this. So I'm not naive to there's more than just the retail side or the financial side. So, but that is the focus for this week's episode, for this episode. So for some context, if you aren't familiar, maybe some international listeners aren't familiar with what Hudson's Bay is, they're a legacy department store, depending on when you're hearing or listening to this. But in early 2025, in early March 2025, Hudson's Bay filed for bankruptcy. So on March 24th, we learned that all but 6 stores would be liquidated and closed. In late April, HBC confirmed that all 80 stores would be liquidated and closed, marking the end of the 355-year-old retailer. So it predates Canada as a country. There's lots of history, which I won't get into today, but it does definitely contribute to the significance of the loss of this retailer in the Canadian marketplace. And everyone has been talking about it. Everyone has been talking about, even if you didn't shop at the Bay, so Hudson's Bay, or also called the Bay, also known as the Bay, has been on the minds of Canadians everywhere. Whether you went to Hudson's Bay frequently, or maybe your parents did, or you have memories as a child going through there, or if you've been to a mall recently, maybe you are familiar with Hudson's Bay or have some shopping experience with Hudson's Bay. So like I said, this is kind of a series that I've been waiting for the last couple of years. And I by no means have I waited for the demise of Hudson's Bay. It's the last thing that I would have wanted, but I've had a lot of thoughts, opinions about Hudson's Bay. So the first time I really talked about Hudson's Bay was in one of my e-business classes in 2020. And in that class, we were talking about the omni-channel strategies of having an online store and having retail that really is synchronized with both of the models of the business. But even back in 2020, I had a lot of criticism, and we had a full deep dive when it came to Hudson's Bay as a store. And that was 5 years ago. A lot's changed in 5 years, but yet the store has not. And that was one of the first anecdotes that I kind of talked about vocally about Hudson's Bay, because students, a lot of Gen Z, a lot of millennials, we came to the conclusion that Hudson's Bay was just the store you walked through to get to the mall. And I'm going to put a pin in that. We'll come back to that later. But that is a good segue to, they should have hit the panic button a lot sooner. The panic button should have been ringing for years. I would say almost a decade, that the wheels should have been in motion to change what they've been doing, because it hasn't been working for the longest time. A lot of people might think, hey, what do you mean it went bankrupt? They're everywhere. Just because a business is everywhere and in a lot of malls and it looks prestigious and it has this history doesn't mean it's not vulnerable to the modern consumer. And really, the product of the store hasn't been good for a while, and it hasn't changed in a long time, which I'll get to in the customer experience segment of this episode. So why do I think the panic button should have been hit a long time ago? Where I first started to see the cracks in Hudson's Bay was when they expanded into the Netherlands. So if you aren't familiar, from 2017 to 2019, Hudson's Bay operated in the Netherlands. So what they did is, it's very similar to what Target Canada did with Zellers, is they acquired a lot of leases from Zellers at the time, which is kind of ironic that we're talking about another Hudson's Bay company. But they did try to break through in the country of the Netherlands. So they acquired leases from former V&A stores and invested over 350 million Canadian into this Dutch expansion and this expansion into Europe. So they acquired about 20 leases from V&D stores or V&D stores, and they were very much like a Hudson's Bay, your typical traditional legacy department store with everything you kind of are familiar with, a Hudson's Bay, a Macy's, etc. So they acquired 20 leases, but they only got 15 done. And they only lasted 2 years in the Netherlands. So it's a very expensive experiment, and that's why it feels and went the way of kind of how Target Canada went, because it was such a poorly done expansion. So I did have a couple experiences at the Dutch Hudson's Bay. So I went to one in Amsterdam, Onderoken, in the main kind of street of the touristy kind of central area of Amsterdam, Amsterdam Centrum. And it was a really nice store. However, it just lacked a lot of personality, and you couldn't tell it was Canadian. And you know, from World War II and the liberation of the Netherlands, and partly credited to the Canadian soldiers, there is a long-standing history between the two countries, where when I go to the Netherlands, I'm Dutch-Canadian, my mother was born there, and anytime I mention Canadian, there's kind of a switch, especially when there is such that still good relationship and fond memories of Canadians. So there is that relationship, and yet there is no signs of Hudson's Bay being Canadian in the Netherlands. The stores looked very much like they do here. They looked kind of more like the Yorkdale, kind of more premium, high-end, modern style stores that some consumers are familiar with Hudson's Bay, but it didn't really show a lot of personality, and that was kind of odd to the Dutch. And when I would talk to my family, my aunts, about what they thought of Hudson's Bay, it's like, it just kind of feels like the store they replaced. And that's, again, a huge red flag, because if the store you're replacing is simply the same thing with a different brand, why do you think that's going to go different? It shouldn't go different because it's kind of the same thing. If you're not bringing something new to the table, if you're not reimagining the retail experience, if you're not trying to be different than the store you've replaced, you're not really accomplishing anything at that point. And then they also found it to be kind of expensive for what it was. They already had a well-established store of the Bijenkorf as this premium department store retailer. They didn't really need Hudson's Bay. And for a long time, Hudson's Bay has kind of lacked that identity. Like I said, the stores were really nice and nicer than a lot of the Canadian stores, especially the one I just visited this weekend, which I'll get to in a bit. But that was my experience at the Dutch Bay. Nice stores, but what was the value proposition to the Dutch consumers? There really, really wasn't something that made you go, oh, I've got to go to Hudson's Bay. Oh, I have to experience a piece of Canada. There's no sign that they were Canadian enough. Because we could have thrown at least a maple leaf, because that's what every retailer is doing nowadays, especially with the Buy Canadian movement. But there's no sign of that. There's no visual identity that they were Canadian. It could have even been branded Hudson's Bay of Canada, and that would have been a lot more significant to the Dutch consumer, or even just introducing them to who the Bay is, because I don't even know if Hudson's Bay could do that to Canadians, let alone a population that doesn't have that 350-year history with them, or that significance of growing up experiencing the Bay or going to the malls and shopping at Hudson's Bay. So that was the first time they should, maybe the second time they should have hit the panic button, because we also had the Sears Canada bankruptcy in 2017. And that's really when alarm bells should have went off, because again, much like the Bay, Sears Canada was that typical traditional legacy department store that had a similar value proposition. If I'm in the mind of a consumer, Hudson's Bay is probably a little more premium, and Sears is a little not as premium, but still very two storied department store brands, and one just hung on a little longer than the other because they failed about a decade sooner. And they tried to make an effort to change their business model. So there was a Sears 2.0 store in the mid-2010s, because that's when it was starting to really fall apart for Sears. And Sears, again, was another big anchor store in a lot of Canadian shopping malls. And what they tried to do was become more of a Winners, a Marshalls, where it was these brands at a discount. It wasn't this full price premium store. They got rid a lot of their appliances and other things that consumers knew to be located in a Sears, and it was just too little too late. They could not adjust quick enough, and it was just great idea, but too late. And there were a lot of stores doing it better than Sears at the time. Winners did it a lot better. So did Marshalls. So the competition didn't make sense, and the overhead of a large store like Sears really didn't make sense in the Canadian marketplace come the 2010s. And I would say it was ineffective beyond that, because the consumers started to change and the stores just felt old, tired, and that's kind of how I feel with some modern Hudson's Bay stores. And I call it modern because it's current, but not modern because of the design of them. So as I was preparing for this episode, I was on YouTube trying to do some research on Sears Canada. And City News posted a video to YouTube published on October 23rd, 2017. The title of the video is, "Could Hudson's Bay go down the same path as Sears Canada?" So already news media, business analysts were kind of predicting, or the long foreshadowing almost a decade before it actually occurred, was the writing was already on the wall. Because it didn't take an above average consumer to go, yeah, they're kind of alike. I don't really shop there as much, but again, that's almost a decade earlier that consumers and the news media was already talking about stuff like this. Business conversations, business networks were already saying, hey, do we think Hudson's Bay is going to go down this road? And in the video, they brought on a professor of marketing or retail, and he said, I wouldn't say it's a definite yet, but it certainly could look that way. And now we know it as a definite, and we know it certainly did go that way. And one of the biggest reasons, and we'll switch gears to the lack of personality and identity. One of the biggest reasons Hudson's Bay failed in the Netherlands and in Canada, because if the stores are closing, it is a failure, is the lack of personality, is the lack of identity. To say that the Hudson's Bay failed in having identity is, I feel, an obvious statement. I feel that, of course it did, because what does a Hudson's Bay store look like? There's no color. It's been bland for decades. You can't really, if you weren't Canadian and you didn't know it was Canadian, you wouldn't know it's Canadian. There is no visual identity. There's no imagery. There is nothing that really tied them to being Canadian. And that is something that really works in Canada, is being Canadian, embracing that Canadian identity, that Canadian heritage. And there's no other company in the world or in Canada that has a longer identity of being Canadian and being in Canada than Hudson's Bay. 355 years. No other company can replicate that, and no other company ever will. There's stores and retailers or brands like Tim Hortons, iconically Canadian, owned by Americans. Yet, they're still so beloved by millions of Canadians that they are the go-to every morning and part of the routine for millions of Canadians. And that's not overstating that there still is that Canadian identity. They've done campaigns with Ryan Reynolds, another iconic Canadian Hollywood star, about being Canadian and trying his new scrambled eggs because, yeah, of course, Tim Hortons is doing these collabs and side projects with celebrities like Ryan Reynolds about his scrambled eggs. Of course, why not? But when they're so generic, you become really forgettable. And that's what a lot of Canadian consumers, that's what happened in a lot of minds of Canadian consumers, is they just forgot. Like, you don't have to go to Hudson's Bay anymore. It was no longer that destination that you had to go to. there's nothing inside the stores that really drew you in or felt a sense of connection or even strengthened the relationship with the consumer, because it just looked like another wide open department store. There's nothing that really engaged you at all. I said this earlier in the episode, but it is that store that you enter to get through to go to the shopping mall. You park by Hudson's Bay, you might stroll through it, or you might just beeline it right to the mall. And when I talked with a lot of my classes, that's kind of what the consensus was amongst young people, is that, yeah, my parents shop there, but I only know it because we park by the store when we go to the mall. And there's this, how we cannot captivate that store traffic, how we can't captivate that foot traffic to even engage them to be curious about Hudson's Bay or even do something further than just be that entrance point to the mall, is such a missed opportunity. Foot traffic in retail is very hard to come by. Millions of dollars are spent every year on marketing and getting people from their houses to the store. Because nowadays, with alternatives like Amazon and other online retailers, you don't have to go anywhere. So to get a consumer to go to the store, you have to level up when it comes to the customer experience. And that's really what it needed for Hudson's Bay to become relevant again, or stay relevant, or just give someone a reason to go there. Because there really wasn't a reason to go to Hudson's Bay. It wasn't for the customer experience. It wasn't because it was a destination. It's not like in IKEA where it's like, oh, this is cool. This is like an outing. There's a restaurant there. You can look at all the furniture, build the furniture. There's nothing tangible that tied someone to Hudson's Bay. They had a loyalty program. Great. Hudson's Bay Rewards. I was a part of that. And I was still a consumer of Hudson's Bay up till this year, where I was on their website looking at clothing and was just an option for me as a consumer. But ultimately, when we don't have an identity, when we have a lack of identity, when we don't know whether we want to be a luxury store, a premium department store, or a budget brand, or maybe something more affordable, more attainable to the general population. So if we aren't a Nordstrom, if we aren't a Giant Tiger, if we aren't a Winners, what are we? Who are the target customers? Who is the target market? And it never really felt clear, because we had the high-end $1,000 jackets, but then we also had Jockey and a lot of more attainable brands for consumers. And it's just such a wide divide, but they didn't really capture either segment of the market. It didn't feel like a premium experience, but then it also wasn't inviting to the more budget consumer. So it's like, what are we doing here? So when we are trying to be premium, it does require premium service. And the reason that a luxury high-end customer isn't brought into Hudson's Bay is because the service level simply wasn't there. If you went to Hudson's Bay in the last decade, you would be familiar that it was either hard to find someone, or you didn't have the assistance that you needed, or it was just an empty store and you happened to see someone at a cash register, or you happened to just find someone by fitting rooms. But there's no one engaging you in that process. And when we talk about a premium, a luxury experience, it is that personalization. It's that attentive service. It's ensuring that their expectations can be met. Because when we price items high, or when we price them above the competitors, there has to be some sort of reason to say to consumers that this price point is worth it. Because if we don't give them a reason, if we don't provide a rationale behind, oh yeah, it's about $15, $10, $20 more expensive than our competition, they're not going to choose us because we're not providing that $10, $20 value of that experience. If we have those attentive sales associates that know the brand, or say, yeah, I like this, but it's just not in the right size, or can you recommend another brand that's kind of like Ralph Lauren or Polo Ralph Lauren or a Calvin Klein, but at a lower price point. Or I want a shirt that looks like this, and I just don't know what to get. It's going to a store to provide that expertise, or to have that expertise to lean on when you don't know exactly what you're looking for. Because a lot of times consumers will know, I need this item, if we're talking apparel, for a wedding or an interview or for work. And you kind of want to lean on whoever's working at the store, because they really should be the product experts of what we're purchasing. And if we're just helping ourselves, then there's no reason to go to the store for that. A lot of specialty stores are still relevant and go-to for a lot of people because of the go-tos for the consumer. They feel confident that whenever they go to that store, that they're going to get the help, the service, and the expertise that they need when they go to that store. Whether that's a menswear store, whether that's a flower shop, or that's a coffee shop. It's all in the small details and the interactions that we can build these relationships with the consumer. Because when we're not building the relationship of the consumer, it's falling apart. It's fracturing and giving people reasons not to come back. And when we don't provide reasons to stay, or we don't pay attention to the customer or the relationship, it falls apart. Very similar when the context of a romantic relationship. Hudson's Bay did not evolve with the consumer. I've grown up with Hudson's Bay. I've probably been going to Hudson's Bay for over 20 years. First experiences as a child. And it's very easy it can be easy for a brand to grow up with a generation. Obviously, Hudson's Bay has made their money on boomers and some Gen X. But now you've seen the shift to millennials being a big part of the purchasing power that consumers have. And they did not simply grow up with millennials. Millennials saw technology evolve. Did not happen as much with Hudson's Bay. Because when we are talking about millennials, who is going out of their way to go to the mall for a brand called Chaps? And when you Google image Chaps, you certainly don't get the brand. You want to give that a Google. So it really doesn't give much confidence in a consumer like myself to go, I don't even know what that brand is. What is that brand identity? Because when we're talking about what brings someone to a store, as a clothing retailer, those are things that you want people to go, oh, I need that. Or, oh, I have exclusivity for these brands. Or I really like that brand. Let me go to Hudson's Bay for something like that. And when there's still Chaps clothing, when I went on Saturday to go to Hudson's Bay, it obviously wasn't working. If Chaps are still left over at a liquidation clearance sale with up to 80% off the retail price, it wasn't working. It wasn't a brand that I want to go to. It wasn't a brand that had any relationship with the consumer. And it wasn't a brand that identified with the consumer that the Bay wanted. So when we talk about not evolving with a customer or a consumer, think about all the logos on the walls of the Bay. When's the last time they changed those up? Have they stayed for a decade or two? Is there a reason to keep them around after a decade or two? We've seen in other clothing retailers that brands come and go. Brands become relevant and fall off. There's trends, there's fads, there's influential pop culture moments that bring a brand back. We've seen this with other clothing retailers like Abercrombie. Really hot, really not, and now they're hot again. It just happens that way. But Abercrombie being a good example is they've happened to grow up with millennials. They were the customers that they were in the early 2000s and still are a big part of their business model. They found a way back to the millennial consumer, and yet Hudson's Bay really never got into it. The Bay had the boomers on lock. They really did. If you talk to the average consumer, if you looked at who was shopping inside the Bay, it was definitely much an older generation because they have the nostalgia. I still have the nostalgia, but it didn't serve me like it did to them because it served a consumer behavior and a habit, and that's just not part of my consumer behavior. So when a millennial or a Gen Z walks into a Hudson's Bay, it feels like a time capsule. And there are differences in Hudson's Bay. If you've been to, let's say, a Yorkdale Hudson's Bay, is a lot different than a regional Hudson's Bay, like the one at White Oaks Mall in London that I went to this past weekend. It looked like a time capsule. I posted a video to my Instagram at Garrett Gaudet of just the final days of Hudson's Bay because I want to capture this. I went to Zellers as it was closing. I went to Hudson's Bay as it was closing. And it just felt old. Nothing changed. Carpet was stained. There's stains in the drop ceiling tiles. The computers that the cash registers have aren't in color. It's a black screen with green text. I didn't grab a video of it because I was kind of shocked. But you kind of think of like, okay, so if a younger person comes into our store and they see kind of the technology we're working with, what is that going to say to the consumer? It still might work functionally, but if any young person sees like, it's not even running Windows XP, what is that telling a consumer? What is that saying about the relevancy or the innovation of a company? Like it might still be functional, but it doesn't speak to them. It says, yeah, we're old and we know it. It serves a purpose. It sends a statement to the consumer that, oof, this company is old. This company hasn't really changed things up. This company hasn't thought about changing their computers. Or if they have, this is kind of where the technology is. It's not innovative. It's not new. It looks as old as their stores do. And when I walked through the stores, it's like, you know what? It felt like a museum. It felt old. It felt dated. It felt very empty. And it was being liquidated. That didn't change it. It felt very irrelevant. And that's simply what happened to the company, is they became irrelevant a long time ago. A very, very long time ago. At the liquidation store when it was being liquidated, it was the busiest I've seen the Bay in years, especially even comparing that to Christmas. And that should be a retailer's easy time of year as far as sales go. Now, to get someone to a store, a lot different, but that should be a lot easier. So when this news broke, this past semester, I was teaching a retail management course with my business entrepreneurship group program. And I had them do a case study of observations of Hudson's Bay because I introduced it a couple weeks earlier where the news about Hudson's Bay started to break, about their bankruptcy, about them really just crumbling and falling apart. And then it was announced, as I alluded to earlier at the top of the episode, that they were liquidating and closing all the stores. So I asked them, and this is a room filled with, I would say, from ages 19, 20 to 40s. So it's a good sample size, but definitely leans younger. And they had such impactful observations that any market research group would have come up with. And again, when the panic button should have been hit over a decade ago, more than a decade ago, this should have been happening. This should have been happening, asking and interviewing people what they think. The feedback is pretty important. Any fast food restaurant you go to, odds are there's a receipt on the back for a survey or feedback to fill out. And you'll get a free appetizer, a free burger. Wendy's does it a lot. But feedback is important to these companies that are still relevant. And if Hudson's Bay took time to even consider doing some feedback, they might find out something. So some of the observations my students had was a $15 delivery fee. In the era of Amazon, and I know all the retailers can't do that, but that was a turnoff for them. Even before they even started to get into the website, that's something that they checked. So even if there is like a spending threshold they need to hit, it was so much of a turnoff that that was the case. Some other things that they said: unorganized stores, dated layout, perception of retail store doesn't match expectations, doing too much. So a lot of stores will niche down or identify the brands that sell, the brands that don't. They said they were rigid, lacked clear identity, too much product, long time for deliveries, failed to develop technology. They weren't clean. They didn't communicate well enough. Lack of competitive pricing. Undercuts perception with low cost. So that's, again, if we don't have an identity to be either premium or low cost, then what are we doing? If we can't appeal to one or the other, and you can do both, you look at the airline industry, they do both, it just doesn't motivate someone to go out and go to Hudson's Bay. It didn't respond to different generations. It didn't use data analytics, store quality. Some of the escalators barely worked, and that's an accessibility issue, but also says, hey, the store's not really in great condition. So there was really minimum level of efforts to really adapt to the consumer. So they were very vocal about this. And would it surprise you that not a lot of my students would shop at Hudson's Bay? No. For all the reasons that I just mentioned, but there's no connection to the company. There's no connection to the brand itself. Yes, you can respect the brand, and I understand the significance of their history and how impactful they were to the development of Canada as a nation, but it stopped there. You can only go so far on nostalgia. Hudson's Bay tried to bring back Zellers, and that, again, was very half-baked. When they said and announced that Zellers was coming back, you would expect, so it'll be like a discount store, and they would have some affordable products or products that were more attainable to maybe some of the premium clothes that they had, of the Hugo Boss, of the Calvin Klein, of the Lacoste, all these luxury premium brands. But no, it was a store within a store. It was one of the departments within their store, but it wasn't even all of their stores. And when I went to a Hudson's Bay with the Zellers, it was underwhelming. You had all this hype, and you were banking on the commodity that is nostalgia to bring customers into the store, and it didn't work. It just fell short again. And that's kind of the effort level that I think really spoke to consumers of, they're not trying anymore. They're not trying to win my business. They're not trying to say, hey, you should be shopping here. It just didn't work like that anymore, because the example of Zellers within Hudson's Bay was kind of like that. Now, it was nice to see a more affordable kind of product range with the Zellers brand, and it could have been much more prominent within their stores, but it was such a small dedication of floor space, of square footage, that really didn't really make a difference. And again, falls really short. The layout of the store. I've talked about store experience a lot, but the layout of the store didn't help. The layout felt very open, which, an open floor plan is fairly modern, but it didn't feel like it did anything to a consumer. You look at stores like a Hollister or some of the other retail stores that really took a lot of focus into crafting an image and understanding what the consumer would want and how to make it different. And it just felt like this big gaping store that really didn't do anything. It just felt cavernous. Sometimes the lighting was poor. The one at White Oaks definitely was poor, where it just it just feels very sterile. It doesn't feel like I want to be there. There's no track lighting that was illuminating the clothing or the merchandise or the products in a way that made them look appealing. It was just very underwhelming. And when you went to Hudson's Bay, you weren't sure what you were getting into. Because like I said, if you're going to a Yorkdale Hudson's Bay, it feels like a premium store. If you're going to a White Oaks Hudson's Bay in London, it just wasn't good. And that was kind of my last visit to Hudson's Bay. I'm a big fan of retail. I enjoyed Hudson's Bay. I've gone to Hudson's Bay. When I'm thinking about clothing, I was still thinking about Hudson's Bay because I liked the brands Only & Sons and Scotch and Soda, and they had those brands. And I was happy that they had those brands, but they can only do so much. And especially when you talk about the in-store experience, it just wasn't great. So I did go to Hudson's Bay, and all I could think of is the Andrea Bocelli song, Time to Say Goodbye. So it was like, time to say goodbye to the store that hasn't changed since 2002. So that's how I felt about the store. It was just so dated, so irrelevant that as a kid, I can't point out what's changed. And in 20 years, you should definitely see some changes. Every store has gone through some transformations. Canadian Tire has done an excellent job with the retail of innovating with technology, utilizing an app. What has Hudson's Bay done? Walmart, 20 years ago, very different store, didn't really have grocery. Now, one of those main grocery stores for a lot of Canadian consumers. So what have we done differently? The price tags still had the old Bay logo. There was a pair of sunglasses for over $300 with the old Hudson's Bay tag. For what? What reason? Why are we still liquidating this product out that we haven't used the logo in over a decade? It's still so old, still dated, none of the products refreshed. And why was that? We had so much opportunity, we had such a legacy. If I had a company that I want to have my products in, Hudson's Bay might be one of those products that say, oh, your products are in Hudson's Bay, because it did hold that level of prestige amongst Canadian consumers. But they still had the old price tags, and the final days really showed what went wrong. It was a dated store. It wasn't clean. It felt old. You didn't really feel like you're in a place where it's like, ooh, this is a nice store experience. It wasn't a nice store experience. Chaps are still available. Again, if a brand's still available during a clearance liquidation sale, they would never bring people into the store anyways. And they also had lots of mannequins for sale. And I wanted to buy a mannequin just for the joke, but the mannequins were $350. And I'm always committed to the bit, but not that committed to the bit. So here's what I would have done as CEO of Hudson's Bay. I would have shrunk the store size to about 3,000 square feet, much, much smaller than what they have nowadays. It's too big. There's too much. They were doing too much. It was so unnecessary. And we know with a business like that, that's a lot of high overhead. That's a lot of expense to hold that rent, to hold that retail lease. There's no reason for them to do that anymore. And that's one way we could have kept the costs down. But we know when it goes to private equity, they only see the value in the real estate and not the brand or the store itself. You could have easily kept the value of the real estate and reused that for other retail. You could have sold that off, become more of a landlord, or whatever the case was for the dozens of stores across Canada. There was ways out of that. We could have maximized the value of that retail space. But now what? Now there's no stores. Now there's no Hudson's Bay. I would have operated or introduced a franchise model. So a franchise model meaning that you can buy your own Hudson's Bay and allow Canadians to have a Hudson's Bay. It would be a franchise model with 100% Canadian brands, supporting an effort to be produced in Canada. They are iconically Canadian. Yet, like I said off the top, no one felt it as much compared to other brands or other stores, like a Canadian Tire. Canadian Tire's kind of now owned that as the quintessential Canadian retailer. It's in the name, but they've really stayed true to that. They have kind of franchise model. They have operations where individuals can own and operate stores of their own, much like a Home Hardware. They've both done a really great job in their retail game. So it would be owned by Canadians for Canadians. It's a really easy, I'm going to be careful with saying easy, but especially in 2025 and the first half of 2025, there's so many Canadians that are just motivated and patriotic and almost nationalistic about buying Canadian, supporting Canadian, and it's a movement that definitely could be captured nowadays if you really put an effort into it. And one of the biggest things I've heard from people is just, I really wish there was an alternative to Amazon that was Canadian. You could easily have and facilitate a marketplace that was Canadian. TheBay.com turned it into an online marketplace for Canadian brands or produced in Canada. It's such a valuable IP that now Canadian Tire owns, which I'll get into that in a little bit. But it does have the option to be that Canadian brand still. And there's still some equity in the brand. There's still some consumer sentiment in the brand. Now, is the consumer population ready? Are Canadians ready for a reintroduction of Hudson's Bay? I don't know. Because it's going to have to be a lot different than what it was, because if it's just coming back as a slightly different version of itself, nobody is going to be interested. The prestige of the brand will be so diluted if you try to bring it back in a lackluster effort. I don't know if that's possible, but I do have trust in Canadian Tire. Like I said, I'll get into that. It would focus on personal shopping. Some of the best retail experiences I've personally had were people that genuinely helped me out or wanted to provide the service of helping me find what I'm looking for or understanding what I'm looking for. Because there's a big difference of helping me versus understanding. They can just push product, or they can say, I think I know what you're talking about. Let me show you to where that is. The product mix would be apparel, but also kind of like a general store. It would allow for smaller towns, tertiary markets, not even secondary markets, I would say populations 50,000-ish, to have their own Hudson's Bay. I think it'd be an option for a smaller town to have an authentic Canadian retailer, and a retailer that has a purpose and has a mission behind it. Because there are retail stores, there are clothing, apparel stores, even in the city that I live in, Woodstock, but it doesn't have that brand power that is Hudson's Bay. And to have the mix of different stationery, if you want to think of a Dutch comparison, it'd almost be like a Hema that does really well, and they are proud of all their Dutch products or Dutch specialty products that they have. It'd be great if this Hudson's Bay would carry Indigenous products from Indigenous-owned companies and brands, and provide a platform for national and international, even provincial distribution for companies like that, providing them a platform. Considering the history of Hudson's Bay and the relations with Indigenous people, it would be a great way to have some reconciliation, but also be a great way to showcase different products that not a lot of stores do in Canada. I can't see a lot of representation of Indigenous brands in Canada. And there's a lot of Canadian brands, Loblaws, Metro, all the food brands. And you just don't see that. And I wish there's more of that. But I also wish there's more local support for producers in the community that they served. So in all the stores that would be located in these communities would be an initiative that you would have to dedicate certain square footage to local producers, whether that's food producers, whether that's your local coffee shop where they can sell their coffee, whether that's confectionery, chocolate, maybe that's the delicacy that is Canadian maple syrup, because you could have maple syrup outlet or something like that. Just get really creative. Embrace the communities that you serve, embrace being Canadian, and be that place to have community, to be that third place that we've missed so much. You could even have in-store cafes or have a pop-up within the store. So it brings the community into the store, but also is that facilitator for that. Now, there's such a big opportunity with that. And lastly, I would lean into being Canadian and Canadian visual identity with Canadian imaging. It's such a missed opportunity, and I think would have done a lot for Hudson's Bay. If you went into the stores and you saw murals of Canadian landscapes or notable Canadians like a Terry Fox, there's so many different ways we could have leaned into being Canadian, and we just didn't. For whatever reason, it just didn't happen. So when we have these new retail stores or these reworked Hudson's Bays, it should be a lot of Canadian imaging and imaging from the communities that we serve, whether those local landmarks, notable people, really embrace the community that you serve, and not a lot of companies do this. So let's close things out. The future of Hudson's Bay. It was announced, Canadian Tire announced in early May that it would pay $30 million to take over Hudson's Bay intellectual property, including its famous Four Stripes motif, various company names, logos, and the retailer's coat of arms. So Hudson's Bay is now in the hands of the very capable Canadian Tire Corporation, and we will see what happens with Hudson's Bay. They haven't made any announcements of what they're going to do with the products. I would anticipate they would carry Hudson's Bay as a brand within these Canadian Tire stores as a way to keep the brand alive. I don't know if there's any retail plans, but if anyone at Canadian Tire is listening, take notes, or I'd love to jump on a call with you to see what we could do with the future of Hudson's Bay. But for now, Hudson's Bay has said goodbye for the last time to Canada and all of its more than 80 stores. It's the loss of a major legacy retailer and a loss to our retail landscape of what we can do when it comes to Canadian alternatives, Canadian shopping. And yes, I am aware that it hasn't been really Canadian for a long time and went to private equity in 2008, but it still meant something to Canadians. And there's still a lot of Canadians that are emotional about it and trying to process the closure of Hudson's Bay. And there's a reason I've done a podcast on it, because it is worth talking about it. There's so many learning outcomes for small business entrepreneurs, retailers, on customer experience alone of what could be done differently. And there's a lot that could have been done differently, and this did not have to happen. One of the main reasons I'm doing this podcast is just because I'm so frustrated, because it didn't have to be this way and it didn't have to go this way. And yet it did, because they had so many resources, so many stores, so many really smart people working at the company or amongst the company, that it did not have to go this way. So in closing, thank you so much for listening to the podcast. I'm going to get back to trying to do monthly episodes again. So this will be May's episode for the Garrett Gaudet podcast. If you want to hear more of my thoughts or follow me along on Instagram, it's at Garrett Gaudet. My website is garrettgaudet.com. Like I said, I am doing consulting for marketing and customer experience. So if you liked what you heard or you liked some of my observations, analysis, I'd love to work with you. So please reach out, garrettgaudet.com. And thanks for listening, and hear me very soon.